see?
My name is Nettie Trask Edwards. I came to the Ardmore Indian Territory from New York, March the 13th, 1898. I am living presently at 201F Southwest. I've been a resident for Ardmore for 58 years.
Well, Ms. Edwards, what was the town like when you came?
It was very small. We had no paved streets. They were awfully muddy, and the sidewalks were wooden. They had no sanitation, and the pigs used to run wild in the streets, and people would buy watermelons from the wagons and take it in their offices to eat and throw the rinds out the window for the pigs to eat.
Mrs. Edwards, I understand that there were wells once in the middle of Ardmore.
There were two wells. One was down near where the J. Hamilton shoe store used to be, one down by the Whittington Hotel, and one up somewhere near where the First National Bank now stands.
Oh?
I remember those.
Yes, ma'am. Well, when did they get the first fire engine? Do you remember?
I don't remember the year that they first got it, but I believe the first one after the volunteer fire department, they named this engine the Annabelle for Judge Townsend's daughter.
Oh?
And that, I believe, was run by gasoline.
Oh, is that right? Well, didn't they once have one that wasn't? Or do you recall that? One that they pulled by hand?
Oh, yes. That was when they had their volunteer system.
Yes, ma'am. Well, of course, Ardmore being right in the middle of so many places, what would you think was the main crop or the chief occupation at that time?
The chief crop was cotton, and this was the largest cotton center in the world.
Oh.
And the men the wagons used to stand all up and down Main Street and Washington Street, and the men would go there with their straw hats and dusters on and sample the cotton.
Is that right?
Uh-huh.
Right in the middle of the street?
Yes, and the street, in the evening, when these wagons disappeared, the street was just covered with samples of cotton.
Oh, well then, actually, they didn't. How would it get away? Would it wind blow
away? Blow away.
No one cleaned it. Well, wasn't there once mines around Ardmore?
Yes, my father operated those asphalt mines, and I believe that's all I can tell you about that. That was just before I came to Ardmore.
Oh, well, actually, you don't remember a lot about that.
Mm-mm.
Well, you said something about coming to Ardmore, Mrs. Edwards. What was the transportation at that time?
Well, everybody had a horse and buggy, fed them, and I believe there was only one public conveyance, and they used to call that the side setter.
Oh.
It was very much like the buses we have now.
Oh.
Only the seats were along the sides. That was the only thing, and then at the same time when you go to a party, you had to go in that as a rule.
Oh.
So several couples could go, without a chaperone.
Sure. Well, how about the railroad, Mrs. Edwards? Was it here at that time?
Yes. The Santa Fe
was
the only railroad then.
Well, how about the car? Do you remember, was there any cars here? Do you remember the first car?
Yes, I do. I think I do. Mr. Edwards ordered 3 Oldsmobile and sold one to Dr. McCoy, one to Willard Blakemore, who was a lawyer, and kept the other for himself.
Uh-oh.
And, of course, everybody wanted to ride in them because they were something new, you see.
Uh-huh.
And the horses, when you'd pass a horse, the horse would become frightened, and some of them would run away.
Well, didn't you have a duster or some kind of costume that you wore then?
Well, no.
Oh, that wasn't fashionable yet.
No.
Then what was the general effect on the town when they came, when the automobile
Well,
came?
everybody wanted to go to the window to see it. Mr. Edwards had that before we married.
Oh?
And when we were keeping company, we went out in this great nearly every night. Main place was the old Chickasaw Lake
Yes.
Club, and we'd go out there for dinner.
Yes, ma'am. Well, how about the residential section, Mrs. Edwards? Where was it?
Well, the most fashionable one was Washington Street.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that day and time, it wasn't paved. And the largest, the most up-to-date house was built by Judge and Mrs. Arthur Walcott, which is now known as the Von Keller home.
Oh.
And they had a decorator from St. Louis come out and decorate the home. And the furniture was all in mahogany and very beautiful.
Oh.
It was a beautiful place. And one night I stayed there with Mrs. Walcott when her first daughter was a little child. And her husband had gone somewhere with some men to stay all night in one of the, I believe, attending court.
Oh.
And while they were gone, we stayed there alone. And long about midnight, we heard a noise on the front porch. And we found that there was somebody trying to get up a large window that that you couldn't raise. Mm-hmm. So the next morning, or that night, we were very uneasy, and we put machines and high boys and everything we could find in the handy up against the doors, so we'd know if anybody was trying to open the door. And Mrs. Walcott decided that she'd get out a pistol. So she got this pistol out, and it was an old rusty thing, and I begged her not to shoot. So we managed to stay up there all night. And the next morning we discovered that there was a man had been trying to open the window, and he had gone around to the back porch where the refrigerator was, and had taken everything there was out of it.
Boy.
So it was a little scary, but we got through the night.
Well, of course, weren't there any neighbors close by, or was there very few?
The closest neighbor was Dr. Wolverton.
And where was his home? Do you recall?
Well,
on Wolverton Street now?
Mm-hmm.
Oh. Well, how about the roads out to homes that were farther out from town? Were they pretty good, or?
No, they were not. They were very rough and dusty.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, if it rained, they were very muddy.
Well, how about in case you had to go somewhere on the... Oh, I noticed you mentioned to me you had to go to the cemetery one time.
Oh, yes. Well, when one time Mrs. Townsend wrote me and asked me to put some flowers on Judge Townsend's grave. And we started out there, and we got about halfway when it was in a buggy.
Yes, ma'am.
And when we got about halfway, the hubs of the wheels went down to the top of the mud, and we couldn't make it, so we had to back out and come home without putting the flowers on the grave.
It was really, really bad.
Yes, it was.
Well, how about communications then, Mrs. Edwards? How did you get things said? Did you have telephones and telegraph or anything like that?
No, not in those early days. I had the telegraph, but we didn't have any telephones. They came in later years.
Oh. Well, how did you work your messages? That's sort of been fascinating to me.
There was no way except when you were young and the young men wanted to make a date. Why, they'd send a boy with a note, and he'd stand there until you gave him the reply.
Oh, boy. Well, how about the law, Mrs. Edwards? How was the law in this country? I know Ardmore's always had a sort of a bloody reputation in the earlier days.
Well,
Who was the sheriff then, Ms. Edwards?
Marshal Hammer. He was marshal at that time, and we had some very wild things to happen. In one instance was some men that had gotten in trouble, and they decided to hang them. So they built a gallows at the rear of the jail, and they had it highly boarded so no one could see in. And they decided then that they would just hang. They hung this Negro, but they didn't the other party, whoever it was. And then they tore down the gallows. And Mr. Mike Gorman was jailer at that time. And they had it was standing, the old courthouse then was just west of the Colliers. And it reached back, extended back as far as
let me think.
Fishman.
Fishman, that's it.
As far back as Mr. Fishman's place. And they had a man that patrolled, what do they call that, the place up above there? They had to walk, they had a catwalk up there over this jail yard, and the man patrolled that with a gun on his shoulder.
Oh, just like a regular prison.
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes, definitely.
Uh-huh.
Well, how about, did you have any town characters? I mean, were there a lot of shootings?
Oh, yes, there was a good many shootings. There was one shooting that happened with Forshay's down on the corner of Caddo and Main Street, and Mr. Greenberg was down there, and he was on the corner when they fired the shot, and it went wild and struck Mr. Greenberg, and he was in the hospital for about 6 months.
Mm.
And they had some terrible characters here, and
well, how about the store locations at that time? You mentioned Caddo.
Well, I don't know that there were so many stores. There were small little places on Caddo, and the old iron store was on the corner of Main and right across from just east of the Santa Fe Railroad.
Oh.
And it belonged to Munzenheimer and Darby.
Mm-hmm.
And it was they called it the old iron store.
Oh. Was it just a general merchandise?
Yes, and a large one.
Oh.
Very large one.
Yes, ma'am. Well, what was just about the first store in Ardmore? Do you recall?
Frank Prinsley.
Mr. Prinsley? Do you know where that was? Was that down about? It wasn't around Munsingheimer or Darby, or do you recall?
No.
Don't recall. Well, how about the leading stores at that time, Mrs. Edwards?
Well, it was W.O. Dustin, and he had I guess really the most up-to-date store at that time.
Oh.
And then there were many other little stores.
Yes, ma'am. Well, how about, what happened to Main Street? Didn't they have an explosion once?
Oh, that was many years.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
What about the explosion? How did it happen?
I really don't remember much about the explosion, but I walked down with some friends to the Hardy Hospital about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we helped in every way that was possible. And we went out and we sent out and bought all the milk there was in town, all the bread, and we made sandwiches for the doctors and the extra nurses that had come up from Gainesville. And then we fed them.
Oh.
And there was no kerosene. All we could use was candles, and we bought all the candles was in town. And we worked there in water. Oh, the floor was covered with water. I guess I don't know how that happened, but we worked there until real late that night. And
was this, you said, at the Hardy Hospital?
At the Hardy Hospital.
Well, Mrs. Edwards, perhaps you could tell me some of the prominent characters of Ardmore at that time. Do you recall any, such as Dr. Hardy and...
Well, Dr. Hardy, Dr. Von Keller, Dr. Bogey, and Dr. Booth.
Were all earlier physicians here?
Physicians.
Well, how about, were there any famous people from Ardmore? Were any elected to any governmental offices that you can recall?
We didn't have a government then.
Excuse me.
We were in the territory.
I meant after...
after statehood?
Yes, ma'am.
No, I can't recall him. Well, Lee Cruz was governor.
Oh, he got the governorship from Ardmore. And I guess, can you recall?
We had a number of prominent lawyers here at that time.
Say, could you tell me some of those?
Well, Furman, Herbert, and Hill. And the three Cruz brothers, Lee, Will, and Cabot. And W.B. Johnson.
And wasn't Mr. Dahlman, was he here?
Not then. He came later.
Oh. Well, of course, there were we haven't talked much about your personal life, Ms. Edwards. We'd like to know, when did you get married?
I married in November the 14th, 1906.
Oh, just before statehood.
I married at my father's on Washington Street. And we took a short trip to Texas and went to live stayed at my father's home.
Yes, ma'am.
On North Washington.
That was your first home?
That was my first home.
Well, I know you've had a very, very interesting life, Mrs.
Well, the early days were very pleasant. Very happy days.
Wasn't there once a dance?
Oh, they had numbers of dances. There was a social club over what is now the city drugstore called the Algonquin Club. And nearly all of the young folks attended those dances they had there. And that's where I first met Judge Walcott. My father took me to that dance and introduced me to him. And I found out that he had married this Miss Haley of Haleyville.
Oh. Well, in those...
And that day and time, there were a few social clubs, not many though. And everybody seemed to have a good time. And the girls would meet and tell all about the dance the night before. We had a very good time in those days.
Now, after they paved, I know they paved Washington just a few years after perhaps
statehood. I have to state it.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, Washington was a very muddy street. They had no sidewalks at all. And they finally paved Washington Street. And when it was paved, Judge Campbell went to some of the city authorities and asked him if he could rope off the block between 7th and 8th Avenue that his daughter was coming home from Boston from school, and she was there at the Conservatory of Music. and wanted to give her a party, a surprise party that night. So they allowed him to do it, and he had an orchestra, and they danced there until late hours. And they served refreshments at the Campbell home.
So really, we don't have any more now. We just do it in a different way.
Yes. Much different.
Well, Mrs. Edwards, I know you've been in Ardmore for quite a while, and you've seen it.
58 years.
Yes, ma'am. And you've seen it grow. And I know you helped me through grade school.
And that's true.
And many others. And perhaps you have some thought on what Ardmore has in the future coming to it.
Oh, I couldn't tell.
Oh. Well, Mrs. Edwards, it's really been pleasant. We sure do appreciate you giving your time.
If I've helped any, I'm very happy that
Oh,
I
you sure have, very much. And we hope that we'll be seeing you other times than just tonight. And we hope that you get to see very, very many more years.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been a series of interviews with the topic being the businesses of Ardmore from 1889 to 1915. The interviews have been conducted by Don Yeager with Mr. Ed Sandlin, prominent banker, and Mrs. Edwards, a very prominent person in the present Ardmore day and life. I am a senior in Ardmore High School at the 1956 class. These interviews have been conducted in January and February of the year 1956.